an alliance from the communities, and the communities wanting to keep that alliance alive, emerges from that alliance. But it also, the arrow also goes back, because the leaders of the social justice movement are going to tell the communities, look, many of your grievances are not going to be addressed right now. Let's focus on one or two so that we can win. So these guys now are constrained. They cannot complain about electricity, they cannot complain about this, but they're going to win because the social justice movement is going to achieve something for them, like their right to vote, their right to negotiate things collectively. The same thing happens with institutional organizations. And here I'm going to get to this too in a second. Let me just get to federal governments first. First of all, I'm writing there federal governments, even though there's all different kinds of governments, right? Federal government is just something they have in the United States. There are a few other countries that also have federal governments, but there are other countries that have all the different types of governments. So here, strictly speaking, should you really just say governments. I'm putting federal government because what I want to stress is the following. Remember, this singular individual is going to replace the state. And let me show you how it would replace the state. When you use the word the state, it's a very fine generality, it's an abstract, vague concept, to imagine a monolithic entity in which the moment the president gives a command, that command gets obeyed immediately by everybody, and the government acts in concert every single occasion, and there are no discrepancies, there are no breakages, there are no fractures. Everything imagines the state as being some kind of monolithic entity. What is important is to replace that concept by the concept of an assemblage of organizations, a whole that's made out of many, many organizations. Let me explain why. First of all, in a federal government like the one in the United States, organizations are subjected immediately to a division of labor between the three powers. There are executive organizations, which is, of course, the White House, plus most of the bureaucracies that do implement policy. There is the legislative part of organizations, which is the Senate, it's Congress, and it's a few organizations that work for the Senate and Congress. And then there is the judicial organizations, which include the Supreme Court, include all the different courts, federal courts, include all the local state courts and all the urban courts, include also the prison system, and it includes the police system, police organizations. So, but not only is there multiple organizations among which there can be conflict. Like there can be conflict between the Congress dominated by Republicans and the White House dominated by a Democrat, or vice versa. But they are not only many organizations at a federal level, there are also many organizations at the state level, because every state in the United States has its own governor, which is executive power. Many have their own congresses, and they don't have senates, but they have their own legislative bodies, and they have their own Supreme Courts, the Supreme Court of Florida, the Supreme Court of Iowa, the Supreme Court of New York. And even at a smaller level, not at the whole state, but each one of the cities has its own mayor, which is its executive branch. They don't have a legislative body anymore, but they have organizations that kind of do and deal with laws, and they certainly have their own courts, and they certainly have their own police force, and their own firemen, and their own postal service, and so on. In other words, it's an incredibly complex ecology of organizations, some operating with different jurisdictions. Federal organizations operate, their authority is valid at the level of the entire country. State organizations, their authority is valid only at the limits of the state. The limits of New Jersey, the limits of New York, the limits of Iowa, the limits of Mississippi. And then there are local organizations whose jurisdiction stops at the limits of the city. The New York City mayor has capacity to demand things to happen, but only within the limits of New York City. And other people the same thing, the limits of Philadelphia, the limits of different cities around, Boston and so on. There will be, of course, then conflicts between organizations with different jurisdictions. You find a corpse in the middle of New York City, and the police of New York City say, hey, this is part of my jurisdiction. I'm in charge of this investigation. But then it happens that the corpse was halfway between New York City and New Jersey, so now the state of New York might say, hey, no, this is really in my own jurisdiction. It's not the jurisdiction of the New York City Police, it's the jurisdiction of the state police. But then it happens that the guy happens to be a terrorist who was planning to bomb something in Washington. Then the FBI comes in and declares that this is my jurisdiction. We are the one who's going to conduct the organization because the Federal Bureau of Investigations is the one who has jurisdiction here. And there might be conflicts between them, right? The local police might say, no, this is my investigation. The state police might say, this is my investigation. The FBI might say, this is my investigation. And they might actually have to go to court to know whose investigation it is. The importance of that is that when you imagine the state as a monolithic entity, you leave out all these jurisdictional disputes. In other words, you don't understand that the government is not a monolithic thing, but a collectivity, an ecology of organizations in which there might be discrepancies and conflicts when jurisdictions overlap. Let me give you another example. Most people who talk about the state, study the state and study the decision-making process that leads to the creation of a new policy. Say, Lyndon Johnson's policy for cities. I can't remember right now its name, but it was something that was signed into law with cameras. And everybody was like, when he signed it into law, it was supposed to be a law in which a lot of money is going to go into renewing urban life across the United States. So your typical political scientist who believes in the state studies the decision-making process that led to that policy. The voting in Congress, and the arguments in Congress of how should the policy be framed, then finally the executive power that could have vetoed that, but doesn't. He reads it and says, well, if we make these changes, then I agree with this policy. Finally, everybody agrees with the policy, and the president signs the policy. And at that point, political scientists stop worrying about it. That's it. The policy has been signed. But the most important thing about a government policy is how you implement it. How you actually transform what is a piece of paper into action. And implementation of policies is a major deal. For one thing, once you sign that policy into action, the president needs to say, well, this is something about urban centers that are going to be renewed. So let's pick all those bureaucracies that impinge on urbanity. So the Federal Exchange Commission that checks on the stock market, well, that's not one. The Tobacco, Drugs, and Fire Weapons Agency, well, that doesn't have anything to do with cities. That's not one. But there's other bureaucracies that do. So then you pick those bureaucracies at a federal level. Then those bureaucracies need to talk to their counterparts at the state level to bring them to be part of the team. And so you're going to get part of this budget. And then those bureaucracies at the state level need to bring the bureaucracies at a city level to work with them as part, they're going to get part of the action to be able to now spend that money in improving infrastructure in the cities and so on. The implementation process, the few political scientists that have studied it, and you can go to Amazon books and type the word implementation, and you're going to find that there's only like 3 books on the subject. Very few people concern themselves with implementation of policies. When people who study implementations have shown that the original thing that was signed by the president compared to what was implemented 7 years later is an entirely different thing. By the time all that money trickles down from the federal agencies to the state agencies to the urban agencies, by the time all the different bureaucracies that have veto power over whether it's implemented here this way or no, all have their piece of their pie, and by the time every